Hello and welcome. If you enjoy calm stories like this, tap like and subscribe for a new one each week. Let's begin. Find a place now where you can rest. Let your body settle into the quiet support beneath you. Feel the gentle weight of the blankets, the softness of the pillow. There is nothing else you need to do, nowhere else you need to be. Just here, just now. Let's begin with a soft, slow breath. In through your nose, filling your lungs with the still, cool air of the night. And out through your mouth with a long, quiet sigh. Releasing the day, releasing all that you have been holding. Let another breath follow. Deeper this time, calm, easy. And as you exhale, imagine a city street. A street you know well, perhaps, but it is different now. The streetlights cast long, lonely pools of amber onto the pavement. There are no cars gliding by. No distant laughter, no footsteps hurrying home. There is only a profound and unfamiliar hush. Look up at the sky in this quiet city of your mind. It is a deep, dark, velvet blue, unmarked by the silver trails of airplanes. The stars, usually shy, seem to burn a little brighter in the clean, still air. It is a world holding its breath. A world paused, and in this quiet, in this stillness, we will begin our story. It is a story of a great sorrow and a great resilience. A story of how the whole, wide world learned to be quiet together. Let the rhythm of the words be a soft blanket for your mind. Let the cadence of the story be a gentle hand guiding you towards sleep. You are safe here, you are resting, and we can begin. Chapter 1, A Whisper in Wuhan. Our story begins not with a roar, but with a whisper. A faint, almost imperceptible murmur in the heart of a city of 11 million souls. The city was Wuhan, a sprawling metropolis in central China, where the mighty Yangtze and Han rivers meet. The year was 2019, the month, December. The air in Wuhan that winter was crisp and damp, filled with the scent of coal smoke and street food. Life moved to its usual, bustling rhythm. Ferries crisscrossed the wide brown rivers. Commuters packed onto subways. Families gathered for steaming bowls of noodles. But underneath this familiar hum, something new was stirring. It began with a cough. A dry, persistent cough that settled deep in the chest. Then a fever. A strange, clinging fatigue that made climbing a flight of stairs feel like scaling a mountain. In the city's hospitals, doctors began to see a pattern. Patients were arriving with a pneumonia of unknown origin. It was aggressive, it was mysterious, it did not respond to the usual treatments. Many of the first cases were linked to a single place, the Huanan seafood wholesale market. This was not just a place for fish and shrimp. It was a vast, wet, chaotic labyrinth of stalls, teeming with life and death. The air was thick with the smell of salt and iron. Water dripped from corrugated tin roofs onto concrete floors, slick with ice and scales. In crowded cages, stacked one on top of the other, were live animals, not just seafood, but bamboo rats, civet cats, snakes, and raccoon dogs. It was a place where the boundary between the wild and the human world was thin, porous, and easily crossed. A virus, a microscopic collection of genetic code wrapped in a protein shell, had likely made a leap. For millennia, it had existed harmlessly in a bat, perhaps. Then it jumped to an intermediate animal, one of those creatures in a cage at the market, its own biology, a stepping stone. And then, in the clamor and the chill of that Wuhan winter, it made the final jump. Into a person, a vendor, a shopper. It found a home in human lungs, a place to copy itself, again and again and again. By the last week of December, the whispers among the city's doctors grew louder, more urgent. On social media, in private chat groups, they shared their fears. Dr. Li Wenliang, an ophthalmologist, sent a message to his medical school classmates on December 30th. He warned them about 7 cases of a SARS-like illness from the seafood market. He urged them to wear protective clothing to avoid infection. He was trying to sound an alarm, but his voice was muffled. He was told by authorities to stop making false comments. Still, the virus did not care for silence. It was already moving. From person to person, through a shared breath, a touch, a conversation. On the very last day of the year, December 31st, 2019, China officially notified the World Health Organization. It reported a cluster of cases of pneumonia, cause unknown, in Wuhan. The world, busy with its New Year's Eve celebrations, barely noticed. Champagne corks popped. Fireworks painted the skies over Sydney and London and New York. Crowds gathered, shoulder to shoulder, counting down the final seconds of the year, unaware that a clock was also ticking on the world they knew. The Huanan seafood market was closed on January 1st, 2020. Men in white hazmat suits moved through the empty stalls, spraying clouds of disinfectant. But it was too late. The whisper had already escaped the market. It was out in the city. And soon it would learn to fly. And still, in the quiet wards of Wuhan, a handful of doctors kept their vigil, watching over the first to fall. Chapter 2. Spread through silver wings. January. A month of new beginnings, a month of cold, clear skies. And in the year 2020, it was the month the whisper learned to travel the globe. It did not need a passport. It did not need a visa. It only needed a host, a human body, and a seat on an airplane. Imagine a vast, dark map of the world, dotted with the bright, glittering lights of cities. Now, from the heart of China, watch as thin silver lines begin to stretch out, like the delicate threads of a spider's web. Each line is a flight path. Each flight, a vessel carrying thousands of people, and among them, silent and invisible, the virus traveled too. A businessman flying from Wuhan to Tokyo for a meeting. A student returning to her university in Seattle. A family visiting relatives in Bangkok. They felt fine. No cough, no fever, not yet. They were in the incubation period, a quiet, deceptive window of time where the virus was multiplying inside them, but the body had not yet sounded its own alarm. On January 13th, a 61-year-old woman who had traveled from Wuhan to Thailand was confirmed as the first case outside of China. 2 days later, Japan reported its first case, then South Korea, then, on January 21st, the United States. A man in his 30s in Snohomish County, Washington, not far from Seattle. He had just returned from visiting family in Wuhan. He had started to cough. He went to an urgent care clinic. The silver thread had reached North America. The World Health Organization, the WHO, held emergency meetings. Scientists worked frantically to sequence the virus's genome, to understand this new enemy. They gave it a name, 2019 nCoV, for novel coronavirus. Later, it would be officially christened SARS-CoV-2, and the disease it caused, COVID-19. The co for corona, the Latin word for crown, because of the spiky proteins that studded its surface, like the points of a crown. The V for virus, the D for disease, and 19 for the year it emerged. But a name did not stop it. In Wuhan, the situation was spiraling. The hospitals were overwhelmed. The city of 11 million people was placed under an unprecedented lockdown on January 23rd. All planes, trains, and buses were stopped. The highways were blocked. A modern city was sealed off from the world, a desperate attempt to contain the fire. But sparks had already leaped over the firewall. They landed in the Lombardy region of northern Italy, a wealthy industrial hub. It may have arrived with a worker returning from China or a tourist. No one is certain, but it found fertile ground. In the small towns around Milan, people gathered in cafes, attended church services, went to local football matches. The virus spread quietly, explosively. Doctors in towns like Codigno and Lodi were baffled by a sudden surge in severe pneumonia cases, mostly among the elderly. By late February, Italy would become the new epicenter of the pandemic. Another spark landed in Iran. In the holy city of Qom, a center for religious pilgrims, again, the virus moved silently through crowded shrines and close-knit communities. The government was slow to admit the scale of the problem, but the virus did not wait for permission. It spread to the capital, Tehran, and then to the rest of the country, carried by travelers and pilgrims. The world was watching, but it was like watching a storm on a distant horizon. There was a sense of detachment, of, it can't happen here. The WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern on January 30th. It was their highest level of alert. But still, the planes flew. The borders remained open. Life for most of the world continued as normal. In those early weeks of 2020, the virus was a ghost. It moved through airport terminals, down subway escalators, across restaurant tables. It was a phantom menace, its presence only revealed days or weeks later, when the coughing began. The silver wings of jetliners had carried the whisper from one city to every continent, save for Antarctica. The stage was set, the web was woven, and still the world slept, dreaming its old dreams, unaware of the dawn that was about to break. Chapter 3. Lockdown Lullabies. March. The month the world stood still. The distant storm that had been gathering on the horizon finally broke, and the rain began to fall, everywhere at once. The scattered outbreaks in Italy, Iran, and Washington state were no longer isolated sparks. They had ignited wildfires, and the only tool humanity had to fight this invisible fire was to retreat. On March 11th, 2020, the Director General of the World Health Organization stood at a podium in Geneva, 0T. His voice was grave. He spoke the word that everyone had been fearing. Pandemic. It was no longer a possibility, it was a reality. COVID-19 was a pandemic. The word itself seemed to change the air. It was a global admission of vulnerability, a recognition that this was not a problem for over there. It was a problem for here, for everywhere. And so, the Great Retreat began. Country by country, city by city, the drawbridges were pulled up, borders slammed shut, schools closed their doors, offices sent their workers home. The message was simple and stark. Stay home. Save lives. It was called a lockdown, a word that sounded harsh, like a prison, but for a time, it was our only shield. 1/3 of the world's population, more than 2.5 billion people, were suddenly living under some form of restriction. Life shrank to the size of our homes. The world outside the window became a diorama, a place to be observed but not entered. The rhythm of life changed overnight. The frantic morning rush was replaced by a slow, quiet shuffle from the bedroom to the kitchen table, which was now also the office, the classroom, the everything. The sounds of the world changed, too. The constant rumble of traffic faded away, replaced by the sound of birdsong in the cities. The wail of a distant siren became sharper, more lonely in the quiet. We learned the sound of our own homes, the creak of a floorboard, the hum of the refrigerator, the gentle tap of rain on a window pane. In the locked-down cities of Italy, a new ritual was born. People went out onto their small balconies at 6 p.m. every evening. They brought instruments, accordions, violins, tambourines. They brought their voices, and they sang. 0T. They sang the national anthem. They sang folk songs. They sang to each other across the empty streets, their voices rising in the twilight. It was a declaration of life, a promise that even in isolation, they were not alone. In New York City, the epicenter of the American outbreak, another ritual took hold. At 7 p.m. each night, the city would erupt. Not with singing, but with applause. People leaned out of their windows, stood on their fire escapes, and they clapped. They banged pots and pans. They cheered. It was for the healthcare workers, the doctors, the nurses, the paramedics, the hospital cleaners. It was a wave of sound, of gratitude, that rolled through the concrete canyons, a thank you to the people who were walking into the fire while everyone else was being told to stay safe at home. We found new ways to be together while apart. We learned to use video calls not just for work, but for life. We had virtual birthday parties, with candles lit on a cake in front of a laptop screen. We had virtual happy hours, raising a glass to a grid of familiar faces. We watched movies together, pressing play at the exact same moment from miles away. We baked bread, so much bread. The simple, ancient alchemy of flour, water, yeast, and time became a source of comfort, a way to create something warm and real with our own hands. Yeast and flour disappeared from grocery store shelves. The world had become small and quiet. 0T. Our days were marked by a strange new lullaby, a rhythm of confinement and connection, of fear and creativity. We were all waiting for the curve to flatten, waiting for the numbers to go down, waiting for the world to start again. And still, through the glass of our windows, we watched the spring arrive, a world in bloom that we could not touch. Chapter 4. Wards of White and Blue. Let us step away from the quiet of the locked-down homes for a moment. Let us turn our attention gently to the heart of the storm, to the hospitals. Let us breathe in and out and be prepared for what we will find there. The hospitals were the front lines, the battlefields, and they were overwhelmed. The virus, which for many was a mild, flu-like illness, was for a certain percentage a brutal, relentless assault on the lungs. It caused a condition called acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. The tiny air sacs in the lungs, the alveoli, would fill with fluid, making it impossible to breathe. It was like drowning on dry land. The wave of critically ill patients crashed into hospitals that were not prepared. Not for this, not on this scale. In Bergamo, Italy, in Madrid, Spain, in Queens, New York, the story was the same. Emergency rooms overflowed, hallways were lined with gurneys. Conference rooms and cafeterias were converted into makeshift wards. Ice rinks and convention centers were transformed into vast, grim field hospitals. The sound of the hospital changed. It was a constant cacophony of beeps and alarms from monitors, and above it all, the sound of coughing, a deep, racking cough that echoed through the halls, and the constant, urgent hiss of oxygen. The most critical patients needed ventilators, machines that would breathe for them, forcing oxygen into their damaged lungs, buying their bodies time to fight. But there were not enough ventilators, never enough. Doctors and nurses faced impossible choices, the kind of choices no one should ever have to make. Who gets the last machine? The 40-year-old mother of two, or the 60-year-old grandfather? It was a battlefield triage, a calculus of sorrow. And then there was the gear, the personal protective equipment, or PPE. The 95 masks, the gowns, the gloves, the face shields. This was the armor for the healthcare workers, and it, too, was running out. Masks designed for single use were worn for a whole shift, then a whole week. Nurses made gowns out of trash bags. The richest countries in the world were scrambling for basic supplies, competing with each other in a desperate global marketplace. The healthcare workers themselves became soldiers in a long, brutal war. 0T. They worked 12, 16, 18-hour shifts. They came home, stripped off their clothes at the door, showered, and fell into an exhausted sleep, only to wake up and do it all again. They lived in constant fear of getting sick themselves, of bringing the virus home to their families. Many moved into hotels or garages to protect their loved ones. Their faces were bruised and raw from the constant pressure of the masks. Their hands were chapped from endless washing, but the deepest wounds were the ones you couldn't see. They were surrounded by death on a scale they had never imagined, and they were the only ones there for it. Because of the risk of infection, families were not allowed in the hospitals. The final goodbyes, the most sacred and human of rituals, were stolen by the virus. So the nurses and the doctors held the phones and the tablets. They held them up to the faces of the dying, so that a wife could see her husband one last time. So a son could whisper, "I love you," to his mother through a screen. They held the hands of strangers as they took their last breaths, standing in for the families who could not be there. They bore witness to the lonely grief of a generation. The wards were a sea of white sheets and blue scrubs. a place of incredible courage and profound heartbreak, a place where the best of humanity rose to meet the worst of a virus. Let us step away from the hospital ward now and breathe with the hush of a sleeping city. Let us honor the memory of those who were lost and the sacrifice of those who fought for them. And still, in the darkest hours, a nurse would hold a hand, a doctor would offer a word of comfort, a human connection in a sterile room. Chapter 5: Curves, Masks, and Distance. As the world settled into the strange rhythm of lockdown, a new language began to enter our lives. It was the language of epidemiology, of public health. Words and phrases that had once been confined to scientific journals were now on the nightly news, on our social media feeds, on the lips of our leaders. The most famous of these was "flatten the curve." We all saw the graph, a simple, powerful image, one tall, sharp, menacing curve that showed what would happen if the virus spread unchecked. It showed the number of sick people soaring far above the dotted line that represented hospital capacity. That was the nightmare scenario, the collapse of the healthcare system. And next to it, a second curve. This one was lower, longer, gentler. It showed the spread of the virus slowed down, stretched out over time. The number of sick people at any one time would still be large, but it would stay below that critical dotted line. It would give the hospitals a fighting chance. That was the goal, to turn the sharp, cruel mountain into a manageable hill, and the way to do it was through our collective action, through staying home, through washing our hands, through keeping our distance. Distance became a new form of care. We learned to stand 6 feet or 2 meters apart. In the grocery stores, footprints and lines were taped onto the floor, a careful choreography for keeping us safe from each other. We learned to wave instead of hug, to smile with our eyes from across the street. We spoke to our elderly parents and grandparents through windows, pressing our hands to the glass, a barrier of love and protection. And then there were the masks. At first, the guidance was confusing. Officials, worried about a shortage for healthcare workers, told the general public they weren't necessary. But as the science evolved, as we learned more about asymptomatic spread, the message changed. Masks were not just about protecting yourself, they were about protecting others. My mask protects you, your mask protects me. It was a simple, powerful act of social solidarity. And so, the world put on a mask. Since surgical and 95 masks were scarce, we made our own. We pulled out old sewing machines. We cut up old t-shirts and bandanas. We followed tutorials on the internet. Suddenly, our faces, the primary way we express ourselves and recognize each other, were partially hidden. We learned to read emotions in the crinkle of an eye, the tilt of a head. The mask became a symbol. For most, it was a symbol of civic duty, of shared responsibility, a small piece of fabric that said, "We are all in this together." But it also became a point of conflict, a flashpoint in a growing cultural and political divide. To wear one or not to wear one became a statement, a sign of which tribe you belong to. We learned about R0, the basic reproduction number, the average number of people that one infected person will pass the virus on to. If the R0 was 3, one person would infect 3 others, who would each infect 3 more. That was exponential growth. The goal was to get the R0 below 1. If each person infected, on average, less than one other person, the outbreak would shrink. It would peter out. So we lived our lives by these new rules. We followed the numbers, the daily case counts, the positivity rates, the hospitalizations, the deaths. The data became a grim daily report card on how we were doing in our fight against the invisible enemy. We were all amateur epidemiologists now, trying to make sense of the charts and the graphs, trying to find a glimmer of hope in the data. Life was lived in a bubble, a small, carefully managed space defined by distance and disinfection. The smell of hand sanitizer became the scent of our era. The simple act of getting the mail or groceries became a complex ritual of wiping down surfaces, of leaving packages to sit for a day, just in case. We were learning to live in a world where every surface, every interaction, held a potential threat. It was exhausting, but it was what we had to do. And still, behind the masks, people smiled with their eyes, a small, silent acknowledgement of the strange new world they shared. Chapter 6: Winter of Loss. The summer of 2020 brought a brief, fragile respite in some parts of the world. The curves flattened, the lockdowns eased. We blinked in the bright sunlight, emerging from our homes like hibernating creatures. We had socially distanced picnics in the park. We saw friends and family in backyards. It felt, for a moment, like we might have made it through the worst. But the virus had not gone away. It had just retreated into the shadows, waiting. As the weather turned colder in the autumn, as people moved back indoors, it began to surge again, and the winter that followed was the darkest and deadliest period of the pandemic. The numbers, which had been a subject of abstract fascination, became a tidal wave of grief. 300,000 deaths in the United States by mid-December, 400,000 by the following January, 500,000 by February. The numbers were so large they became numbing, impossible to comprehend. Each one, a person, a life, a story, a universe of love and memory, extinguished. The scenes from the spring returned, but on a vaster, more terrible scale. Hospitals in Los Angeles, in London, in Rio de Janeiro, were pushed beyond the breaking point. Oxygen was running out. In some places, the pressure in the pipes was so low that ventilators could not function. Doctors and nurses, already exhausted and traumatized from the first wave, had to face another, even bigger one. The burnout was immense, the moral injury profound. The most haunting image of that winter was the refrigerated truck. These were large, white, windowless trucks, the kind used to transport food. They were parked outside hospitals because the morgues were full. They were a quiet, grim testament to the scale of the loss. A symbol of a society that could no longer handle its dead with the dignity they deserved. The holidays arrived, a season that is meant to be about gathering, about closeness, about family. But this year, they were a source of anxiety and sorrow. Public health officials begged people not to travel, not to gather, to celebrate only with their immediate household. Many listened. They had quiet holidays at home. They connected with loved ones over video calls, a screen separating them from the warmth of a family hug. But many others, tired of the isolation, desperate for a sense of normalcy, traveled anyway. They gathered for Thanksgiving dinner, for Christmas, for New Year's. and the virus, a silent, uninvited guest, came with them. The holiday gatherings fueled the fire, leading to another spike in cases, hospitalizations, and deaths in the weeks that followed. The holiday tables of 2020 were marked by empty chairs. There was the chair of the grandmother who had died in a nursing home, alone, the chair of the uncle who had caught the virus at work, the chair of the friend who was on a ventilator in the ICU. The grief was everywhere. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket over what should have been a time of joy. We lost so many. We lost the elderly, the vulnerable, the ones with underlying conditions. But we also lost young, healthy people. We lost doctors and nurses, bus drivers and grocery store clerks, teachers and parents. The virus was not indiscriminate. It hit communities of color, the poor and essential workers the hardest. It exposed and deepened the inequalities that had always been there, just beneath the surface. Black Americans, Latino Americans, and Native Americans died at much higher rates than their white counterparts. That winter was a long, dark night of the soul for the entire world. It felt like the darkness would never end. It felt like the grief would swallow us whole. We were tired, we were scared, we were heartbroken. And still, candles flickered in windows, keeping vigil through the dark. Chapter 7: Race for a Vaccine. Even in the darkest days of that terrible winter, a light was beginning to dawn. It was the light of science, the light of human ingenuity. It was the hope of a vaccine. Never before in human history had the global scientific community mobilized so quickly and so effectively. Usually, developing a new vaccine takes a decade or more. It is a slow, methodical process of research, development, and trials. But this was not a usual time. This was a global emergency. And so, scientists and researchers worked around the clock. They collaborated across borders, sharing data and discoveries in real time. Governments and private companies poured billions of dollars into the effort in an initiative that in the United States was called Operation Warp Speed. They were not cutting corners on safety, they were cutting the red tape. They were doing steps in parallel that were usually done in sequence. Manufacturing of the most promising candidates began even before the final trial results were in, a huge financial gamble that was necessary to save time. The world was pinning its hopes on several different vaccine technologies. There were the traditional methods, using a weakened or inactivated version of the virus to teach the immune system what to look for. 0T. But the frontrunners, the ones moving at incredible speed, were based on a revolutionary new technology, Messenger-RNA, or mRNA. For decades, mRNA had been a promising but unproven area of research. The idea was simple but brilliant. Instead of injecting a piece of the virus into the body, you could inject a set of instructions. The mRNA is like a recipe, a piece of genetic code that tells your own cells how to make just one small, harmless piece of the virus, the spike protein, that distinctive feature of its crown. Once your cells make the spike protein, your immune system sees it, recognizes it as foreign, and builds a powerful army of antibodies and T cells to fight it. Your body learns how to defeat the enemy without ever having to face the real, dangerous virus. And then, the mRNA instructions, being very fragile, simply melt away. It was an elegant, clever solution, and it was fast. Scientists could design an mRNA vaccine on a computer in a matter of days once they had the genetic sequence of the virus. Two companies, Pfizer, in partnership with the German company BioNTech, and a newer American company called Moderna, were leading the mRNA race. Their clinical trials were enormous, involving tens of thousands of volunteers from all walks of life, all around the world. The world held its breath, waiting for the results. And then, in November of 2020, the news came. First from Pfizer, then from Moderna. The results were stunning, better than anyone had dared to hope. The vaccines were about 95% effective at preventing symptomatic COVID-19. It was a monumental scientific achievement, a triumph of human reason and collaboration, a light at the end of a very long, dark tunnel. But there was a catch. The mRNA vaccines were incredibly fragile. They had to be stored at ultra-cold temperatures. The Pfizer vaccine needed to be kept at -70 degrees Celsius, colder than a winter in Antarctica. This created a massive logistical challenge. A new cold chain of special freezers and shipping containers had to be built almost overnight to get the vaccines from the factory to the arms of people around the world. On December 8, 2020, the first dose of a clinically authorized vaccine was given. The recipient was Margaret Keenan, a 90-year-old grandmother in the United Kingdom. The image of her, in her Christmas t-shirt, getting the shot was broadcast around the globe. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated hope. A few days later, the first vaccine was administered in the United States to a critical care nurse in New York named Sandra Lindsay. The first to receive the vaccine were the most vulnerable, the elderly in nursing homes, and the most exposed, the frontline healthcare workers. The largest vaccination campaign in human history had begun. It was a race against time, a race to get enough shots into enough arms to build a wall of immunity against the virus before it could mutate and evolve its way around our new weapon. And still, in labs around the world, scientists kept watch, their microscopes trained on the future. Chapter 8: Variants in the Wind. The virus was not a static enemy. It was a shapeshifter. Every time it copied itself inside a human body, there was a chance for a tiny error, a mutation in its genetic code. Most of these mutations were meaningless. Some even weakened the virus. But every now and then, a mutation would arise that gave the virus an advantage. It might make it more transmissible, better at jumping from person to person. Or it might make it better at evading the immune system. As the pandemic wore on, these more successful versions of the virus began to emerge and dominate. They were called variants of concern, and they were given names from the Greek alphabet to avoid the stigma of naming them after the places where they were first detected. The first major variant of concern was Alpha. It was first identified in Kent, in the southeast of England, in the late autumn of 2020. Alpha was about 50% more transmissible than the original strain of the virus that had come out of Wuhan. It spread rapidly, driving the devastating winter surge in the United Kingdom and quickly becoming the dominant strain across Europe and North America. The race between the vaccines and the virus had just gotten harder. The virus had just gotten faster. Then, in the spring of 2021, came Delta. First identified in India, Delta was a game changer. It was even more transmissible than Alpha. Some estimates suggested it was as contagious as chickenpox. It caused a catastrophic wave of infection in India. The healthcare system collapsed, crematoriums worked day and night. The images of funeral pyres burning against the skyline were a vision of hell. Delta spread around the world with breathtaking speed. It was a much more formidable foe. It caused more severe illness, especially in the unvaccinated. And it was better at causing breakthrough infections in people who had been vaccinated. 0T. The vaccines were still very effective at preventing severe disease, hospitalization, and death, but they were less effective at preventing infection altogether. The dream of herd immunity, of eradicating the virus completely, began to fade. It became clear that we would have to learn to live with this virus in one form or another. The Delta wave was a cruel blow. Just as things were starting to feel hopeful in many vaccinated countries, just as masks were coming off and life was returning to a semblance of normal, Delta pulled the rug out from under us. It was a grim reminder that this pandemic was not over, not for anyone, until it was over for everyone. And then, just as the world was struggling to contain the Delta surge, another variant emerged. In November of 2021, scientists in South Africa and Botswana identified a new variant with a shocking number of mutations, more than 50 of them, with many on the crucial spike protein. It was named Omicron. Omicron was a bolt from the blue. It was so different from previous strains that it represented a new leap in the virus's evolution, and it was incredibly, astonishingly contagious. It spread faster than any respiratory virus we had ever seen. It tore through the world in a matter of weeks. Case numbers soared to previously unimaginable heights. On a single day in January 2022, the United States recorded over 1 million new cases. But as the Omicron wave exploded, a strange and hopeful pattern began to emerge. While it was much better at evading the immunity from vaccines and prior infection, it seemed to cause, on average, less severe disease. It was more likely to stay in the upper respiratory tract, the nose and throat, and less likely to invade the deep lungs. For a vaccinated and boosted person, an Omicron infection was often like a bad cold. For the unvaccinated, it could still be very dangerous. But the link between infection and hospitalization, while not broken, seemed to be weakened. Omicron was like a quicksilver sigh. A massive, almost vertical wave of cases that peaked quickly and then began to fall just as fast. It left behind a vast new wall of immunity in the population, from the sheer number of people it had infected. 0T. It was, perhaps, a sign of the virus evolving into a more endemic state, less of a deadly pandemic threat, and more of a persistent, disruptive, but manageable part of our lives. And still, the wind carried the seeds of change, a constant, invisible evolution happening all around us. Chapter 9. Hope and Hesitation. The arrival of the vaccines was a miracle of science, but getting those vaccines from the freezer into the arms of 8 billion people was a challenge of a different kind. It was a challenge of logistics, of equity, of trust. The first and most glaring problem was vaccine equity. The rich countries of the world, where the vaccines were developed and manufactured, bought up most of the early supply. They pre-ordered enough doses to vaccinate their populations several times over. This meant that while people in North America and Europe were getting their first and even second doses, Many poorer countries in the global south had not even been able to vaccinate their frontline healthcare workers. It was a catastrophic moral failure, as the head of the WHO called it. It was also a failure of public health strategy. As long as the virus was spreading and mutating anywhere in the world, it remained a threat to everyone, everywhere. The emergence of variants like Delta and Omicron from largely unvaccinated populations was a brutal lesson in the truth of the statement, "No one is safe until everyone is safe." Initiatives like COVAX were created to try and ensure a more equitable distribution of vaccines, but they struggled with a lack of funding and a lack of supply. The world was learning a hard lesson about global solidarity in a crisis. Even within wealthy countries, the vaccine rollout was not smooth. It was a story of hope, but also of hesitation. While many people were desperate to get the vaccine, lining up for hours or frantically refreshing websites to book an appointment, a significant minority were hesitant or outright opposed. This vaccine hesitancy was fueled by a storm of misinformation and disinformation, spreading like wildfire on social media. False claims about the vaccines being unsafe, about them containing microchips, about them altering your DNA, preyed on people's fears and anxieties. The erosion of trust in institutions, in science, in government, had created fertile ground for these conspiracy theories to grow. The healthcare workers, who had been hailed as heroes at the beginning of the pandemic, now found themselves on the front lines of a different kind of battle. They were not just fighting the virus, they were fighting fear and falsehood. They spent countless hours patiently talking to their hesitant patients, trying to answer their questions, to allay their concerns, to explain the science. But they also faced anger and hostility. The burnout and the fatigue were immense. After 2 years of trauma and sacrifice, to see so many people refuse the one tool that could end the pandemic was a source of deep despair for many of them. Slowly, cautiously, the world began to reopen. One of the most fraught and emotional debates was about schools. The closure of schools had a devastating impact on children's learning, their social development, and their mental health. The costs were not borne equally, with children from poorer families falling the furthest behind. So, with masks, with improved ventilation, with testing, classrooms began to fill up again. The sound of children's laughter returned to the playgrounds. It was a sign of hope, a step toward normalcy, but it was a normalcy tinged with anxiety. Teachers, students, and parents were all navigating a new world of risk assessment, of quarantine rules, of learning to live with the virus as a constant presence in their lives. The path forward was not a straight line. It was a series of steps forward and steps back. A dance between hope and hesitation, between the desire to return to the world we knew and the cautious reality of the world that now was. And still, in a quiet classroom, a teacher helped a child with their mask, a small act of care in a complicated world. Chapter 10. Long Shadows. The pandemic was not just a crisis of acute illness. It was an event that cast long, lingering shadows over every aspect of our lives. Even as the sirens faded and the hospital wards emptied, the echoes of the trauma remained. One of the most mysterious and troubling of these shadows was long COVID. For a significant number of people, surviving the initial infection was not the end of the story. They were left with a constellation of debilitating symptoms that could last for months or even years. The most common was a profound, bone-deep fatigue, a feeling of being perpetually drained of energy. And then there was the brain fog, a strange, disorienting cognitive impairment. People struggled to find words, to concentrate, to remember things. It was as if a thick cloud had descended over their minds. There were also shortness of breath, heart palpitations, muscle aches, and a host of other symptoms. Long COVID was a puzzle. It could affect anyone, even people who had only had a mild initial illness. Doctors struggled to understand it, to treat it. Patients, many of them young and previously healthy, found their lives completely upended. They were too sick to work, to care for their families, to live the lives they had known. They were the hidden casualties of the pandemic, living in its long shadow. The pandemic also cast a long shadow over our collective mental health. The isolation of the lockdowns, the fear of illness, the grief of losing loved ones, the economic stress, the constant anxiety and uncertainty, it all took a massive toll. Rates of depression and anxiety soared, especially among young people. The world was experiencing a shared trauma, and the psychological wounds would take a long time to heal. The economic shadows were long and dark as well. While some sectors of the economy, like technology and e-commerce, thrived, others were devastated. The small businesses that are the lifeblood of our communities were hit the hardest. The restaurants, the cafes, the bookshops, the hair salons, the places where we gather, where we connect. So many of them had to close their doors for good. We saw it in our own neighborhoods, the for lease signs in the windows, the shuttered storefronts that were once filled with life and light. Each one, a dream that had died, a life's savings that had been lost, a community that had lost a piece of its heart. The pandemic also changed the way we work. The forced experiment of remote work proved that for many office jobs, it was possible. This led to a fundamental rethinking of the role of the office, of the nature of the daily commute, of the balance between work and life. It offered new flexibility for some, but also blurred the lines between home and work, making it harder than ever to switch off. We were all changed by the experience. We had lived through a historic, world-altering event. We had seen the fragility of our systems, the deep cracks in our societies. We had also seen the incredible resilience of the human spirit, the power of community, the brilliance of science. The world after the pandemic was not the same as the world before. It couldn't be. We were all living in the long shadows it had cast, trying to find our way in a landscape that was both familiar and forever changed. And still, in the quiet of the evening, people looked out at their changed world and wondered what would come next. Good night. The long story is told. The great global fever has, for now, broken. Let your mind be still. Let your body be heavy and soft. Imagine now, not an empty street, but a street that is slowly, gently waking up. A single porch light flicks on, a warm, golden welcome in the deep blue of the dusk. Then another, and another, a quiet chain of light and hope, spreading from house to house, from neighbor to neighbor. Picture a front door opening. The sound is soft, not a loud creak, but a gentle click. A family, once separated by caution and care, is reunited on a doorstep. The hug is long and real, no longer a wave through a window pane. There is a quiet joy in it, a deep and profound relief. The world learned so much in that time of quiet and sorrow. We learned about our own vulnerability and our own strength. We learned how connected we all are, how a whisper in one city can become a roar that echoes across the entire planet. We learned that the people who keep the world running are often the least seen and the least rewarded. And we carry with us the quiet promise of being better prepared, of building stronger, kinder, more resilient communities, of listening more closely to the scientists and to each other, of remembering the lessons learned in the great stillness. But for now, there is nothing left to do but rest. The story is over, the world is quiet, and you are safe in your bed. Let the last of your thoughts drift away like clouds across a peaceful night sky. Let the gentle rhythm of your own breathing be the only lullaby you need. Breathe in and breathe out. Sleep now. Sleep well. Good night.